I love having it on my phone, just to be able to, like, especially in the morning when I'm waking up, I can just immediately put it in there. So I kind of want to be really explicit with where I hope to go. I hope that we as women can see the Lord's kindness and his goodness to us, his sovereignty as we study through this lesson, and that then we would be encouraged, I guess, in your kind of big idea on your sheet. Actually, would you read it for us? The big idea on your study sheet is right underneath your reference text,
where it says the Lord often.
Mm-hmm.
The Lord often allows Christians to experience his kindness and sovereignty through the kindness of God's people themselves. God's people in turn should live boldly, trusting in the Lord and displaying his kindness to others.
So there's two things running parallel through this story. The first is we see the Lord's kindness and the Lord's sovereignty, and we're going to dig into that. But then it's very obvious that we see people's kindness. And so I hope that just kind of, those two concepts are rolling around in our hearts and brains as we're walking through this, and we'll kind of dig more into it as we go. But and feel free that these sheets are yours. You can fill them in as you like. You don't have to fill them in if you are not a visual learner. I just like to have something to write with. So yeah, we'll go ahead and jump in. And what we'll do is, before we read through the text, I want to give a little bit of background information, just because Ruth is kind of an in-depth story. But Ruth does anybody know what tribe she was from?
Moabite?
Yes, so she was a Moabite. Does anybody know where the Moabites come from by any chance? I didn't know this, I had to look it up. The Moabites are descendants of Lot, which is back way in Genesis. So they're technically distant relatives. And if you look like in Numbers, the Israelites are, as they're journeying to the Promised Land, they have encounters with the Moabites, and sometimes not so great. The Moabites often lure them into idolatry and not so great things. So they are sometimes friends, sometimes not. It kind of goes back and forth. And Ruth, it says in Ruth 1 that it's in the time of the Judges. So just kind of for me, I like to know where we are in the scene. So it is after the Exodus. The Israelites have come out of Egypt with miraculous acts of God. And it is before King David and the monarchy. So King Saul was the first king of the Israelites, and that hasn't begun yet. So we have all these judges that are coming up and popping and dropping. It's just kind of a chaotic time. But the Moabites are neighbors. They're close by. And this was a time during the famine in Israel. And so Elimelech, who is Naomi's husband, he and Naomi and their sons went to Moab, and that's where Ruth, a Moabite, married one of Elimelech's sons. And so it's interesting to kind of look at Naomi's story, because Ruth's story is hard, but Naomi is that's a rough day. You know, your husband's died and both of your sons have died. And so that's kind of where Ruth starts off for us, is that Ruth is a widow of her husband, and Naomi is a widow to Elimelech. And so Naomi encourages the two widows, her daughter-in-laws, to return to their lands, to marry their young, and she says, just start over, And Ruth, we kind of know the story of Ruth, that is that kindness and loyalty of Ruth to stay with Naomi. And so that's what happens. Naomi and Ruth are together. And so that's where we kind of get to this story here. And I'm giving a lot of background. You can read through it. It's a really short little story. But Ruth and Naomi are wandering and looking for food. And so we find we find Ruth stumbling across Boaz's field. And so there's some cool things that we see, like in chapter 2, Ruth is gleaning in the fields of Boaz. And I love, what's the first word that comes to your mind when you hear Leviticus? Laws and rules, right? And so I love looking at Ruth's story, because you see the laws of the Lord playing out for the good of his people. And so he's set these laws in place that, the sojourners, the vulnerable in society, are able to glean in their fields, in the fields of others. And so while the reapers are walking through and reaping the harvest, they're to leave some behind for any of the marginalized in society to come back and have some. And so that's where Ruth and Boaz meet. Ruth is gleaning in Boaz's field. And rather than being cruel or saying, you only get this much, Boaz sends her with tons home. So that's kind of the setup of the story. And it's the ultimate chick flick. I love Ruth. I mean, it's like such a good story. But Ruth comes home, tells Naomi, I was in the fields with Boaz. he gave me all this grain, and Boaz was kind to me, and then Naomi, we see her really kind of respond. And so I know that we're studying Ruth chapter 3, but I would love to look at Ruth 2:20. Would someone read Ruth 2:20?
Oh.
Thanks so much.
The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, that man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsmen redeemers.
Okay, cool. So that's where I wanted to kind of get to next with, there are two concepts kind of at play with Ruth chapter 3. There's the levirate marriage and kinsman redeemer. And you have them and some references on your study sheets. But levirate marriage, I'm going to just kind of blow through that first because kinsman redeemer is really what we're going to focus on. But levirate marriage is spelled out in Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10. And it's another one of the laws that the Lord puts in place to protect his people. And so what levirate marriage is, if a man dies and he and his wife have not had children, the man's brother is to take the man's widow as the dead brother's widow as a wife. And when she bears a child, the firstborn child will have her late husband's name. So it's a way to carry on names, and we know genealogy is super important. We've seen that, in Matthew, and we see the genealogy of Jesus. And genealogy is really going to come into play in Ruth. And this was something that was really cool to me and humbling, honestly, to see the way the Lord works. So the Lord, back in Deuteronomy, has set levirate marriage in place, but you'll notice that it's for a brother. It's not for a distant relative. Boaz is clearly a distant relative. Ruth didn't even know him. He wasn't at the family reunion. They haven't met before. So kind of a cool thing there. But the kinsman redeemer is another law that the Lord has set in place in Leviticus. And it is, and I would love to, we could just spend weeks on this whole story. So I'm blowing through it, but there is reference if you want to go back and study it. And I don't want to just, overlook it, but I want to dig into better stuff. So kinsman redeemer is this concept that the Lord set in place where if an Israelite is put into indentured servanthood or loses his property, a close relative has the right to come and redeem that property or to purchase that person's freedom out of the indentured servanthood. So it's a way to make sure that there's no oppression just set up for the long term within the Israelite community, that we're caring for our brothers and sisters, but the relative had the option to do that. And so we see that Naomi has said, oh, we are saved. He is our kinsman redeemer. And we're going to go back and focus. I want you to keep Ruth 2:20 in your mind because we're going to go back to that verse a couple different times because we'll see some cool things there. But so that's kind of the background. I wanted to provide a little bit there. And you'll see there's a word hesed on your study sheet. That word we are going to focus on throughout the whole chapter. It is the Hebrew word, and I am not pronouncing it properly because I don't have the hesed. But hesed is, it's used, oh my goodness, I'll have to look in my notes, but I want to say it's like 244 times in the Bible. And it's often used in reference to the Lord to his people. So it's covenant kindness, it's unfailing kindness or loving kindness, but it has this this connotation of a loyal devotion, a loving, loyal, devoted kindness towards the Lord's people, and it's an initiating, overflowing, gracious thing. And so I know immediately my mind just kind of starts to think towards New Testament concepts of lavishing grace, and that is something that we kind of see with Hesed, but it's just this overwhelming, loyal kindness. So we actually saw Hesed be used in Ruth 2:20, where Naomi praises the Lord for his kindness. Okay, cool. So any questions there? Any interesting things? I don't want to insult your intelligence. You may have known a lot of this before, but I just like to recap it. Any thoughts on the levirate marriage or kinsman redeemer, or just seeing the Levitical laws play out? And if you don't, it's okay. Don't worry. It's a lot of information too.
Well, we just finished studying about how the Israelites, the whole nation of Israel is set apart.
Right.
So it's just cool to go back and look specifically at some of the Old Testament ways that God set them apart and
Right.
cared for them.
Right. Yeah, I love that. That's so great. Okay, so, all right, so we're going to walk through the text. And would someone like to read? And if you don't want to read, totally fine, no pressure at all. But if you would like to, I would love for someone to read verses 1 through 5. We're going to kind of break it up into paragraphs and talk about it paragraph by paragraph so that mainly we can get to our application.
I'll do 1 through 5.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay, so one day Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you where you will be well provided for? Is not Boaz, with whose servant girls you have been a kinsman of ours? Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself and put on your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do.
Okay, great. So, what are any initial thoughts as we read that little chapter?
Weird.
Talk about
Really? You want me to do what?
Yeah, that's some boldness. I mean, like, I remember, so Jared, my husband, we went to high school together, and I remember after third period being stressed about walking down the hall where he would be like, are we going to interact? Do I make eye contact? Do I initiate? Do I not? Like, but this is some boldness. Like, this is not just like, oh, maybe I'll just pass him in the fields. This is like legit. But
I'm going to dress up and smell good, and then
Yeah.
I'm going to lay by his feet.
yeah, and some of the cultural background too. This is Naomi telling her, prepare yourself as a bride.
Yeah.
And so this is not just like, you know, put on your high heels and your Sunday best and go get out there, girl. But like, this is like, hey, go be a bride. Anybody remember that Naomi is her mother-in-law? Like, let's talk about that mother-in-law relationship for a second.
Awkward.
But that's kind of amazing. I mean, like, I love my mother-in-law, but I don't really imagine my mother-in-law. I can't, you know, her son has
Encouraging you to
died.
find a new
coming-
person.
Yeah, just that's some boldness on her part. But you see this kind of confidence in Naomi that this is how it's going to work out. And we see that she's got that Ruth 2:20 in her mind, that the Lord has been kind to the living and the dead. So she's seeing, and I don't want to give away too much, but she's seeing the Lord's working through coincidences like Boaz's field and Ruth meeting Boaz. And so we see that Naomi has rightly seen the situation and she's acting now according to it.
Well, and she's received kindness from Ruth by
Right.
Ruth coming with her. So
Mhm.
for her
Right.
to be grateful for Ruth supporting her.
Right. Well, and look at
she can
Ruth's
extend
response.
that same kindness.
Yeah. Look at Ruth's response. I will do all what you say. That's kindness. Yeah. Which is interesting. You see that obedience and kindness come together, which is kind of cool. So-
Obeying her mother-in-law.
Yeah.
Complete
Huge.
obedience.
I don't really want to marry that guy. Why are you telling me?
Right?
Maybe I mean, that's just
No, but it's a great point.
That's just another perspective. It's not what necessarily what she's feeling.
Right.
You know.
Right. Right. No, I actually think that probably is, I mean, as a woman, I'm never thinking just one thing. So I'm sure in the back of Ruth's mind, she's like, are you sure this is going to work? You know,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure there was some insecurity to push past through. So, okay, so does anybody want to take a gander at the first little outline that you have there for verses 1 through 5, what those blanks might be?
The Lord's plan.
Yeah, that's a great one. I had sovereignty, but I think that's just the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Just that you see the Lord's, he's in charge here. He's not splitting the Red Sea, but he is still very much in charge. And then Boaz's kindness. Yeah. We see his kindness in how, and we don't necessarily see that as much in verses 1 through 5 for Boaz, but we see that leading up, and we'll continue to see that. So, all right, will someone read for us verses 6 through 9?
So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned and discovered a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer."
Okay, and then before we start talking, would somebody actually read Ruth 2:12 for us?
May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge.
Okay, so Ruth 2:12 is where Boaz and Ruth are talking in Boaz's field, and that was what Boaz said to Ruth. And then so we saw Boaz speak to Ruth in Ruth 2:12. Now we see Ruth propose to Boaz. Some fun facts for you. We know that she proposed because the corner of your garment or corner of your wings, you might have a different version, when Ruth says spread the corner of your garment over me, that is a word, it's a Hebrew word, kanap, and it's the same word that Boaz used in Ruth 2:12 when he said, "May the Lord protect you under his wings." And you might again have a different version, but still that the wings of the Lord are under his feathers in Ruth 2:12. And so what we're seeing here, or I'll ask you kind of, what do you see, what's happening, or how do you see the connection between what Boaz said, "May the Lord bless you and hold you under his wings," and what Ruth is asking by saying, "Would you spread the corner of your garment over me?" Do you see any connections there? Anything kind of popping out?
Boaz is talking about God's love for the people Israel, and she's talking about Boaz's love and protection
Yeah.
for her and her mother-in-law personally.
Exactly. So I love it because Ruth has gotten it. She's asking Boaz to be the answer to the prayer
Right.
he prayed for her. And that's pretty powerful, I mean, and it also is kind of like, I'm gonna call you for your word. You want this for me. So it's such a sweet interaction between them. But yeah, so it's the Hebrew word kanap, and it's used in Leviticus. I can tell you the exact reference.
And it means, again, what is it? Does it mean the proposal, or does it mean
So
protection?
it can be both. It's protection, but it's used in Leviticus 18, and I don't have the exact. I'm trying to find the exact reference for you, but it's used in Leviticus as a marriage proposal. Oh no, pardon me, not Leviticus. Ezekiel 16:8, and it's referring to the Lord and His bride.